So last week, the latest statistics on death, self-harm and assaults in prisons and immigration removal centres were published. They make for pretty grim reading. The independent analyst Russell Webster has provided a very helpful summary of the statistics on his website, and we'll share a link to Russell's page in the follow-up emails. But as he points out, and drawing on those statistics, deaths increased by 40% from 283 to 396. 81 of those deaths were suicides, an increase in 13% from the previous 12 months. In the 3 months to June, self-harm incidents had increased by 8% in male institutions and by a whopping 47% in female establishments. And assaults had also increased in the 3 months by 14%. So, one of the questions this really, posed for me is are prisons more lethal for women than they are for men? Is that part of the problem here, or is there something else going on? Hannah, do you have some thoughts about this particular question?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to get this kind of detail around the different experiences that men and women have within prisons. And obviously, one of the issues is that prisons were generally designed for men, and because of the numbers, it's much easier within the male estate to sort prisoners out by dangerousness or provide different, and I'm clearly not suggesting the male estate is wonderful, but just through sheer economies of scale, it's easier to provide more resources. And then those who actually end up in prison, we know women's offending profile is very different. And I think that there's a couple of issues I wanted to pull out of this in particular. The effects of COVID and the lockdown, I think within the community, I think we started to forget how extraordinary and stressful this last 2 years has been for people, and that lack of contact. And I've found, going back into the office and seeing students face to face, it was quite a shock to the system. It was wonderful, but we've got used to living in a very abnormal way. And for people who've actually been locked in a cell, who've had to cope with lockdown and have had not just the not seeing their friends, but that kind of distancing from their families, not being able to see them at all, must have been unimaginably difficult. And prisons really were one of the forgotten groups within lockdown in particular. And we know that a lot of women in prison are the sole carers for their children. Their children were either taken into care or with different relatives. So it has had a disproportionate effect. The lack of mental health care is a problem across the entire prison estate, but I think given the specific needs that women have. And to touch on a controversial point, that actually this shouldn't be a controversial point, this demonstrates the need for sex-based data, and the fact that the Ministry of Justice is collecting data by gender self-identification rather than sex. These kind of figures show us that there is often a difference between how men and women are treated and their experiences and their outcomes, and it's important for everybody that that data is recorded as accurately as possible. I'm not saying don't collect gender ID data, but we really do need, if we lose this kind of data, then it fundamentally disadvantages us in understanding these problems, being able to challenge inequalities, and actually being able to suggest important, practical, workable situations that will save people's lives. So this isn't just an esoteric academic argument about statistics collection, which does not sound the most interesting subject. There are really tangible, important results because of that.
This was something, and we'll be discussing this more in the next item, that Lucy Baldwin at the event last week, the Women's Place event last week, she had a number of really quite heartbreaking examples, and the one that really stuck with me was a mother of young children who absconded from court mid-sentencing to go and collect her children, to take them round to her sister so that their children had somewhere safe, because she could sense she was going to be sent to prison. that's not something that a male prisoner or a male defendant will generally have to worry about.
No.
And certainly separation from children, and young children in particular, is a deep source of stress and anxiety for many women in prison, in a way that, again, male prisoners, not saying they're obviously not sad, don't find it distressing to be separated from the children, but it's a very different dynamic. So I think that point about gendered data, which is properly sex-based, is a really important one. And thank you, Hannah, for mentioning that. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of questions coming in on the Q&A. So one from Mark Burton, I mentioned this earlier. He's asking, do persons with lived experience get involved in this particular discussion around self-harm? Really good question, Mark. One of our panelists may want to pick up on that. And also a question here from Kate. Is there any data surrounding correlation of previous experience and instances of self-harm? Well, we have two kind of doctors of criminology here, one a professor of criminology, and I'm sure the other one will soon to be a professor of criminology in the not too distant future. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on data around correlations around self-harm and previous experience, and also the question of lived experience. Either of you, or indeed Helen, would like to, may not, but any thoughts on any of those questions?
I don't know how detailed it is in full. I mean, things like the Bromley briefings are very useful in terms of, which I think is it the Prison Reform Trust?
Prison Reform Trust, yeah.
And giving us data on, for example, like how many women in prison have experienced sexual violence or domestic violence. And I think the percentages are sufficiently high. You could say there's probably quite a degree of overlap there. I'm not completely up to date on all the literature, but I think it would certainly be an important thing for people to look at. And again, in terms of being able to put in, identify women who are particularly at risk, and then measures that could be put in place to ensure that they're not left in this kind of distress in custody.
And it was, it was actually something that was just women in prison have been talking about this just this morning on Twitter, amongst other places. I'm just looking at their tweet here. Almost 2/3 of women in prison have experienced domestic abuse. This has to change. I'm sure that there are male prisoners who have experienced domestic abuse, but I would be very surprised if they're at anything like that level in terms of, they may well have experienced other violence, of course, and indeed many male prisoners will have experienced violence in their lives, but the skew in relation to domestic abuse victimization is very heavily kind of skewed by birth sex, actually. So that might be is certainly another consideration as well.